Peter Bruce is a very well-known journalist and columnist. He's worked for the Financial Mail, the Business Day, writes in the Sunday Times, and it's great to have Peter with us in the studio today. So Peter, welcome, and great to have you for the webinar.
Trevor, thank you very much. Nice to see you again.
Yes, and you. And I'm sure you're really happy about your Springbok victory. I know you're quite an ardent supporter.
Yeah, I'm afraid I am. And I'm sure we all are. I mean, it took me about 10 minutes to be able to speak after that. It was quite something. And I think I live in a very little village, and I know most people here stayed up until about 3 o'clock in the morning and had to be turfed out of the local bars.
Correct. Yeah. No, I think that was all around the country. And I was trying to Google and nowhere actually could give me the answer. I'm sure it must be a first that any international rugby team has won 3 matches in a row by 1 point, let alone in a World Cup. So I think that
was quite extraordinary, you know. And I don't know whether you saw just what it did to the country. We'll talk about it maybe later. But I was most struck. The thing that most struck me after the game was pictures coming from really deep rural South Africa and a very large crowd of rural South Africans seated, blankets and balaclava or warm caps on their heads because the night was cold. Thousands of people watching this thing all over the country on TV. It was quite extraordinary.
So great for nation building. And as you said, I think we'll end up on that perhaps on a good note.
Yeah.
But let's get started on perhaps not such a good and rosy note, which is let's discuss state-owned enterprises. And I know it's something that you've written quite a lot about. And if we look really at our government, and it's been in power 30-odd years, and we look at the current state of state-owned enterprises, and we look at the likes of SAA, Transnet, Armscor, Prasa, the Post Office, and a list of others. I mean, they're really in terrible condition. They've literally required hundreds of billion rands of bailouts over the last 20, 30 years. How do you really see this playing out? And realistically, do you think the government are doing the right things to try and get these state-owned enterprises back on track?
Look, that's the great question of our time, Trevor. First of all, please, can you hear me okay? I just need to know that I
can hear you perfectly. So that's
okay, great. So, you know, what's happened in the last year or so is interesting because during COVID, the government thought that it would use the crisis in the sense of not letting a good crisis go to waste, and so it created. It tried to create a recovery program, and everybody got involved. Business got involved, and the unions, and the parties, and other elements of civil society. And I remember business doing an enormous amount of work on how to save the country, how to turn it around, and it was completely ignored afterwards. It just died and went away. And as we've come out of COVID, business has learned a lesson from that, and it's gone back to the government and said, "Look, let's have another look at the economy. We're doing really badly. Logistics are gone. Power is off. We're in deep trouble. But let's focus on just 3 aspects rather than trying to save the whole economy. We'll just do 3 things, and the 3 things were obviously power, logistics, and crime." And the interesting thing about this, Trevor, was that the government didn't ask for help from business. Government doesn't, business went to government and said, "Please, can we get involved again?" And they're very cautious around the government because in order to get government buy-in, you have to treat them with really kid gloves, and they're very sort of proud, and they won't take insults, and So what you have is a curious thing whereby business has been able to form quite effective crisis committees in energy and logistics and crime with the state. We know there's been quite a lot of work on the energy side, and we can see some of the results now as load shedding begins to ease off, and they've been able to bring capacity back online that's been offline. Um, and so there's some measure, I suppose, of success in that. And what the Electricity Crisis Committee has done is keeping that on track and keeping the business and state elements of it talking to each other. And business stays in there because it can see that whatever it's suggesting is being relayed and being acted on, because there are people in the presidency who are doing that. On Transnet, it's quite complicated, and we're in the middle of it now. There are two reports going around from and about Transnet, one by Transnet itself about how to recover its own operations, and one by something called I think it's called the Logistics Crisis Committee and National Logistics Crisis Committee. And they're also now producing another report on how to reshape the logistics industry and railways and ports in South Africa. And of course, they are talking about allowing private enterprise into these industries, and what the different roles of the government and the public and the private sector should be. And it's very detailed work, but it's also incredibly, how can I sort of say, it's kind of politically correct. They keep on reassuring the government that yes, we want the kind of growth that you want. You want inclusive growth. You want state industries are very, state industries are very important. It even says at one stage in the Crisis Committee report, state-owned enterprises must be at the center of the drive towards accelerated economic development. So this is the kind of thing the government wants to hear, whether or not, and it applies at energy and it applies here, because these things are still haven't broken the back of the reforms that they need to. The big question is, okay, we can have all these great plans. Can the ANC, because that's ultimately what you are trying to do here, you've got to get the ANC to say yes. You've got to get the ANC deployment committee to say yes to candidates who they might not politically support, but who know how to do their jobs. So whatever you do in this country with the government, you're doing it with the ANC, not the government, because the ANC is the one that runs the government. And the ANC, as we know, is a deeply compromised body. And, until it says yes, and it hasn't said yes yet, we can't say whether any of this stuff is going to work. It hasn't said yes to a new CEO for Eskom. It hasn't said yes to a new CEO and lots of other senior managers at Transnet. And until they do, until the deployment committee, because it's a deployment committee that delays all of these things. We think that there's something going on. It's not. It's very simple. There's a fight between a minister, in the case of Eskom, Pravin Gordhan, and ANC deployment committee. That's the explanation. There's not a mystery around it. And so it's all of these state-owned sectors are up for reform. Business is trying to do it on these three fronts: crime, logistics, and energy. But it's slow, man. It's really, it's almost imperceptibly slow sometimes. We have seen some improvements in some places, but it's difficult. SAA is basically been sold. But this is once again, where you have to figure out that you're doing business with the ANC here, because the buyer assumed that that he was going to get the SAA that was still grounded, and that he would then be able to shape it himself once he paid however much money he was going to pay. I think the promise is to put 3 billion rand into the airline once control passes to him. But no, the ANC decides, look, we've got this airline thing called SAA and a few planes on the ground, let's fly them. So it immediately starts accumulating losses again. SAA can't possibly be flying profitably. And so while it might not be adding to old debt, which has been kind of ring-fenced, it's creating new debts. Price of fuel is high. It's flying routes that are contested. It's now going to fly to Brazil, which nobody else wants to fly for, presumably relatively good reasons. So that will be a political decision. Once again, it's an ANC decision. So the sooner the new owner gets to buy this, when he gets to buy this airline, take it over, he may make completely different decisions if the ANC doesn't throw its toys out the cot. The post office is going absolutely nowhere. I think when Mark Barnes left in 2019, its assets exceeded liabilities by 5.2 billion rand. And I saw a report about a month ago saying debt now exceeds the assets by 12.5 billion rand. So that's a turnaround of 17 billion in 4 years? It's impossible to imagine. What has happened to that? Denel is a basket case, as we all know. I had some numbers. I'm just going to read them off my phone here. The Denel, I found this yesterday. So Denel's order book in 2016 was 23.5 billion rand, and today it's 8 billion rand. Revenue in 2016, 8.3 billion. Now it's 1.4 billion. So Denel, I don't know how you save Denel. I don't think you should. I suspect, and we already know that the Saudis have tried to buy it. They'll probably privatize it properly, call it something else, but it'll end up in foreign hands in some way, I think.
So Peter, on this, and I think you've answered what I was actually going to ask you next, a little bit about the structural reform, which, as we know, is focused in things like energy, on new energy, logistics, infrastructure, and you've touched on it. Just another quick question. I remember going back, however long it is, 5 years ago now, when President Ramaphosa was elected president of the ANC and then became president of South Africa. You were quite positive, if that's the right word, on him. However, the last year or two, you've certainly become very tough on him and critical of him. Can you just perhaps give a brief comment on his leadership, presidency, and how he's either met or failed your expectations?
Well, I mean, I think he's disappointed a lot of people, and he should probably be disappointed in himself. He certainly was speaking a very, very different game before he was elected than the game that he's playing now. He thought that he had this, and that it would be a quick and easy thing, even though what he wants to do is reform and transform at the same time, and that's not always easy, because the transforming can often be, if it's political, part of the problem. But he has let himself down, and I didn't think that there was much point in not pointing that out. So it's this country is very badly run, and it needs to be said. And I had thought that it would be better run when he came to power. This is a man I've known for a long time and admired for a long time and like him. And he's a very nice chap. But he really has made, in my view, a terrible mess of the country. It hasn't got better since he became president. And in many cases, our situation has become worse. And so, I think that it's important. And you could, and I've been frequently criticized for having backed him in the first instance, and that's fair enough. But I think it's important that people in positions like mine, and I've got access to the media, try and call things by what they are, and if you make mistakes, well, it's there for everybody to see.
Yep. Peter, let's move on to the elections coming up next year. The government hasn't yet announced actual election dates, and I was reading this last week in the paper that they perhaps missed some deadlines that they needed to meet to get the elections in the first half of the year. Yeah. So they're talking about the second half, August, September. So we'll wait to see the actual dates. In terms of the results, we know surveys have shown or indicating that perhaps the ANC is going to dip below 50%. And then there's the multi-party coalition that's somewhere in the 30s, perhaps, if you add them all together. Just how do you potentially see the results going? And if we're looking at coalition politics, do you have any views on how the parties might align themselves?
Yeah, it's a bit like making rugby predictions, but I think it's very difficult. A week is a long time in politics, and there's still 6 months to go before the election. Anything could happen. But the polls currently, in other words, if the election were tomorrow, what the polls are saying is that the ANC would fall fairly significantly below 50%. And the two polls are, one was done for the Brenthurst Foundation by a London-based pollster, and the other one was done by the Social Research Foundation, which is a local organization, and their polling is done for them by an outfit called Victory Research, which is owned and run by Gareth van Onselen, and whose research is excellent and deep. And they both put the ANC at between 41 and 45%. And if that is any guide to what's coming for the ANC, then it's in big trouble, because that could get below 40%. But it's hard to see that happening. The South Africans, and it's one of the reasons that we're all still here, Trevor, is that we're very conservative people. We don't change our minds easily. And we mustn't underestimate the scars that apartheid have left on the people who were victims of it. And so change is going to come to South Africa. There's absolutely no question about it. That's why I still stay here. But it will be slow. So I don't have wild expectations of big change in this election. 2029 is the one where everything changes, in my view. But anyway, for this one, assuming that the multi-party coalition, this is the result of John Steenhuisen's Moonshot Pact speech back in April. So they've been able to put together, according to the Brenthurst Foundation poll, about 36% of the vote. If you add the DA and the IFP and the other members of that coalition together, you get to around 36%. And with the ANC on 41, there's not much separating them, and there's more movement to come, no doubt. There were some standouts from the multi-party coalition. Musi Maimane hasn't joined it yet. And when the poll was done, the African Christian Democratic Party hadn't joined either. So there's a bit added to there. Maybe it gets to 30, 36, 37%, approaching 40. The other big standout is Songezo Zibi's Rise Mzansi Party, which has flown pretty much under the radar at the moment. And I don't know whether that's a function of their strategy or a function of money. But they've done a completely different thing. They will not join the multi-party coalition before the election, but I suspect they'll join it or do business with it after the election. They certainly won't do business with the ANC. Songezo Zibi's view of the ANC is that really South Africa needs a break from the ANC, and he's going to do whatever he can to make that break occur. So if there is an opposition bloc big enough to knock the ANC off or out of government, then he'll help it along. Where you'll see a difference, even if the ANC remains in government and Ramaphosa is still the president, you could see a big difference in the way Parliament works. A lot of these parties are determined to turn Parliament into a second source of power in the country. At the moment, it's a rubber stamp for the executive. But even if the ANC were in government, with less than 50% of the vote, it wouldn't have a majority in Parliament, and you would see dramatic change, I suspect, in the way Parliament then responds to government, in who runs its committees, who's on the committees, who the speaker is. Those things all have to be voted on by Parliament. And a divided Parliament, the one where the ANC doesn't dominate, is going to come up with very different answers to the one that we've had in the past.
So, I mean, we watched the US politics at the moment, and they're voting for a new Speaker of the House. I mean, that's a good example, I guess, where two parties absolutely. And it's quite close, etc.
Yeah.
Peter, just touching on, I suppose, some of your comments now. Again, I realize it's probably very difficult, but if you have to sort of look forward 5, 10, 20 years even, who do you see, and it's not necessarily, not only talking about ANC, just across the political spectrum, who do you see the up-and-coming or next generation of political leaders and influencers?
Yeah, look, it is difficult to make these predictions. I don't, and I make them without really any serious knowledge of what's going on in the EFF. The EFF in all these polls, by the way, Trevor, is doing pretty well. They and independently of the ANC, and I don't think, by the way, that even if it was possible to keep the ANC in power, I don't think the EFF would do it. And if it got to the point where the EFF could keep the ANC in power, it could also just as easily put the multi-charter coalition in power. So it's a weird organization, very unpredictable, obviously very unreliable, and I don't know enough about the people who move in and out of it to be able to pass judgment on them. But there are two people who I do really take seriously going into the future. One is in the ANC. He's a cabinet minister, the Minister of Justice, Ronald Lamola, is a very sharp young guy, and is being set up by the party to play a bigger role in the state and in the party going forward. There's no question about that. He had a stab at one of the positions, I think it was the party presidency, in the last elections in December, and it was a three-way race, and he lost out, but he didn't lose by a lot. And he's got clout, and he's very smart, and we'll hear more of Lamola. And the other one is Songezo Zibi, who is a brilliant young man who has very strong ties to rural South Africa and to the sort of, the Africanness and the African cultures in South Africa, and is a thoroughly modern Democrat. He would be able to create and grow here an appreciation for the markets, for how you create wealth, for the risks and the rewards that you have to share in order to make it properly inclusive. Those would be my two big picks. They're both guys, I'm afraid, but this is a very materialistic society.
Thanks. I think those are two good picks. And Peter, so I think we've got to move on. We've got probably time for a couple of more questions. So I think we need to touch on South Africa's foreign policy a little bit.
Yeah.
So we know the stance that South Africa took when Russia invaded the Ukraine. We know that South Africa is quite closely tied with China, and we do a lot of business with China, yet there's tension between the US and China. We also know that with the Middle East breaking out in conflict now, how South Africa has positioned themselves. And if we look at South Africa's trading partners, I think the US and Western Europe make up our two biggest trading partners, and then there's China. Can you perhaps just give some comments or insights on what you think about South Africa's current foreign policy, how it's playing out, how they get to it, and does it affect things like our terms of trade? Yeah,
I think part of the answer to that, Trevor, is that there is this AGOA summit in Johannesburg, I think it is, later this week. And as you remember, people had become so annoyed by our position on Russia and the Ukraine that American senators were suggesting that the summit be moved elsewhere. And the administration, the Biden administration, has stuck with South Africa. And I think some credit must be given to the government for going out of its way to make sure that, the incipient rebellion against South Africa on Capitol Hill in Washington didn't go too far. There's no question, though, that we are torn between two poles, mainly America and China. Russia's a kind of Russia's a broken economy at the best of times, and not important to us economically at all. But there is a political hankering for what the Russians did for the ANC during the struggle. This is even though most of the ANC leadership lived in London and not Moscow, but that's conveniently forgotten. What I think we're seeing, even though we may deeply annoy the Americans and the Europeans now with our position on Palestine, is that however badly we behave or however irritating we become to them, we're just too big to walk away from. And, if you look at Africa and if you look at a world that is now, coming out of globalization and beginning to form camps against each other, kind of new Cold War or version of it, South Africa still has, as the apartheid did, two things in its favor. One is its geographical position, and two is its mineral wealth. And no great power is going to walk away from this in Africa because there's no replacement for it. We're lucky in a sense, and we can probably even ride our luck. It may, we may run out of luck one day. Pretty soon, global warming will make it possible to ship goods from England to China or Japan over the northern coast of Russia because it'll all have defrosted, rather than come all the way around the Cape. And those things might begin to change the way people perceive of the Cape, but for a long time to come still, we are able to play these two off against each other and be annoying to them without any really deep consequence. The interesting thing is, too, that the Americans and the Brits and the Europeans are much happier investing here than the Chinese or the Russians. The Chinese are really uninvested in South Africa in a real way, partly because the place is so dirty and untidy. I've heard so many stories of Chinese investors coming to South Africa and almost leaving because the cities are so disgusting. And they just simply unable to sort of think straight, having driven through the center of Joburg to speak to the Gauteng Development Agency or whatever that might be. And just would rather not come here, go to Rwanda, wherever it might be, that's got a different approach to litter and waste. But the fact that Americans are and the Brits and the Germans and Europeans generally are still here and they're still making value-added goods here is a huge plus for those of us whose sympathies might lie with those countries, because what they do here is simply irreplaceable by the East or China or Russia in the next 3 or 4 decades. Not, it's just way beyond what they're capable of doing. You might buy a mine and dig up minerals and all that kind of stuff, but nobody's going to make cars and semiconductors and all the sorts of things that they make here on the level, at the scale that they do, other than the people who are already doing it.
So, Peter, we've got 2 minutes to go. So I think that's the perfect intro, perhaps, to just final comments from you. And I want to end off on a positive note. And we spoke about the rugby and how sports can unify the country, etc. Just perhaps concluding comments on what you think South Africa as a country, the government, whichever angle you want to take it, what are we doing well and getting right?
Yeah. Well, the first thing that we have to sort out is how we win it next time. How we just get to own it. And there's no reason, if you look at the squad, by the way, I mean, who leaves? There are about three or four people who are going to leave, Dwayne maybe Faree and a few others, but we still have an incredible squad left. We've still got a really good coach, or head of rugby in Rasmus. There's no reason we can't begin to dream about winning this thing for a fifth time. And isn't it lovely that we can do this with African leadership in both the cricket and rugby teams that we're doing, that we are playing? We succeeded in rugby, cricket's still to come, but it was the picture of these people in Thohoyandou in Limpopo the other night that I found that just struck me as being absolutely incredible. We were all, for a moment there, Trevor, doing exactly the same thing. We were watching our guys far from home win something difficult for us, and we were all together, and we all felt exactly the same about exactly the same thing. And if you can increase the number of times we all feel that way, you've got a winning country. It's hard, but it's not impossible. And I don't know how to do it. Sport has certainly shown us what it feels like when you get it right. And if you can do, if you could do it economically, if you could build a car that becomes the biggest selling vehicle in the world in South Africa, wouldn't that be a great thing to be proud of as well? We need some big economic achievements here. I lived in Spain for many years as a journalist, and I always remember 1992. The Spanish had a most amazing year. They had the Olympic Games in Barcelona. They had the World's Fair in Sevilla, and they launched their first high-speed train service between Madrid and Seville. So there was enormous amounts of money being spent. There was ferocious corruption in all of them, but they pulled it off, and they really got 1992 in Spain put that country on the map, because the effort to get there was a unified effort. Everybody wanted something, and it would be nice and look, they have a lot of money in Spain because they're members of the European Union, that if we could find something to do as a country together, that we could chart the growth of, be it a high-speed train line from Joburg to Cape Town, I don't know. But we need to do something big and unifying that we can all see and touch. And I think that would help us a lot.
Peter, thank you so much. That was full time for us, and time really went quickly, and really appreciate your comments and your insights, and look forward to Sunday when I can read them again. So have a great rest of the week, and appreciate your time to dial into the webinar today.
Well, thank you so much for having me. I really enjoyed it. Take care.